In the evening, Ekaterina, a friend, called and, knowing that the next morning the guys were going to the village to visit relatives, asked for a ride for her guest, her mother. The next day, Mrs. Natalia, a woman in her 60s, stood with her daughter at the entrance, wearing a gray coat and a blue beret that matched her eyes. "Oh, excuse me for imposing, but my daughter says you don't mind." "It's all right, it's on our way, plus we'll cut down the journey a bit, and it would take you 4 hours by bus." "That's true." She took off her beret, adjusted her chestnut hair, cut in a bob. "With you, it'll be much faster." An hour into the journey, they took a shorter route, and half an hour later, forests and hills appeared, the road winding along the hillsides, sometimes sparsely covered with vegetation. "I haven't traveled this road in a long time," Mrs. Natalia said to herself. "Before, this mountain, almost entirely bald, and now look at how the trees have grown." She sighed. "Oh, time, how everything changes." "What's changing, Mrs. Natalia?" "Well, these hills and mountains are overgrown now. Earlier that slope was bare, with small pebbles on it, as if someone had smashed them with a hammer. So, one day, I rolled down that embankment, scraped my legs and arms." "Wow, really? What made you go there?" Mrs. Natalia, sensing the interest of her companions, looked towards the mountains again and told her story. Her family had lived in the village all her life, her father drove the farm director, and her mother worked as an accountant. Natalia was the only daughter in the family, loved and cherished, destined for a good education and a life in the city, but things turned out differently. In the 9th grade, Natalia fell in love with Petr, who was a year older. He amused her with various fables as he escorted her home, only he knew where he got them from. Natalia's parents hinted to her that the boy came from a large family. What could they offer their eldest son, financially? Perhaps that's why Natalia cautiously accepted the courtship of the village boy, if it weren't for one incident. The girls and several boys from school went to that very mountain, which was 7 kilometers from the village. Natalia also went with them, even though it was her birthday that day. They rode there on bicycles and, climbing higher, the youth stretched along a narrow path, trying not to look down. And suddenly someone screamed, the noise of stones rolling down was heard, and along with them, Natalia was dragged down the slope, fear in her eyes, desperation, and attempts to grab onto the loose slope with her hands. Petr rushed to help, sliding down after Natalia. Somehow, Petr managed to pull Natalia out, but he scraped his knees, hands, and even his face, to the blood. When Natalia was back up and he had one more leap to go, blue beads spilled out of his pocket. And he dashed down the embankment again after them, as if they were the most precious thing in his life. "Petr, stop," they shouted to him, "where are you going?" But he, managing to gather a few beads, made it to the path. First of all, he made sure that Natalia was without any fractures, saw her gratitude in her eyes, and rubbed his scratched fist. There were several beads lying in his palm, where a few more remained on the torn thread. The beads were simple, clearly inexpensive, but they required money, which Petr's large family clearly lacked. "Oh, what's this you have?" Natalia asked, forgetting about his scraped knees. "It was supposed to be your gift," the boy confessed in a subdued voice. "I wanted to give you these beads. Today is your birthday," he said and, turning away, began to cry. These were silent and almost invisible tears, either because of the ruined gift or out of joy that everything turned out all right and that he and Natalia were whole and unharmed. He had been imagining for a whole week how he would give Natalia the beads, bought with the money saved from his school lunches. "Give them to me," she said, "I'll string them together and wear them." He silently reached out with the remaining beads. "I'll buy you others, just a little later." "You don't need to buy anything, these are the most beautiful beads, and if there aren't enough, I'll wear them as a bracelet. Because I've never been given such gifts in my life." She collected the beads. They were halved in number, the rest, apparently, had rolled down the steep embankment. Petr began to accompany her home more often, and Natalia's parents increasingly scolded her for her friendship with him. Before the army, Petr worked, and Natalia studied in the city. They only met on weekends. She was supposed to see him off to the army, but she was late. By the time she reached the village, the bus with the recruits had already left for the station. And then Natalia sat down on a bench and burst into tears. Their friendship was strange, they didn't promise anything to each other, not even kissed. Besides, Natalia also heard reproaches from her parents: get an education and stay in the city, why bother with rural life, and forget about Petr, he's just a rolling stone. And so she cried then, overwhelmed by emotions. What will he think, she pondered. Will he think that her parents didn't allow her to come to see him off, or that she herself didn't want to come? But 2 weeks later, Natalia received a letter, with a return address from the military unit. Her heart pounded with joy, her hands didn't obey as she tried to carefully open the envelope. "Hello, my little bead," Natalia read and pressed the sheet to her chest. He had never called her that before, and that made her feel unusually light and sweet inside. "It's a pity we didn't see each other on the day of my departure, but I took with me a school photo where we both stand near the park when we went to a sports rally in the district. I'll look at it, remember you, and dream of our meeting." Natalia read the letter in one go, then slowly began to read it again. So, for 2 years she had been corresponding with Petr, who in every letter called her not only by her name but also "my little bead." And this bead became like their password, connecting their hike to the mountain and the broken beads when he saved her. And when he returned from the army, Natalia confessed to her parents that she didn't love anyone else but Petr anymore, and that she didn't care how many siblings he had or how much money he had in his pocket. Natalia's parents arranged the wedding, sighing that the groom was as poor as a church mouse. And 2 years later, the son-in-law repaid the favor for entrusting him with their daughter. He was unmatched at the state farm as a mechanic. He tinkered with any machinery, bringing it to perfection, astonishing his superiors with his ingenuity. Even if he drank a little with the guys sometimes, he was still the same kind-hearted and placid person. "My little bead, forgive me." All right, Petr," Natalia grumbled. "You'll sleep it off now, and you'll be fine again, father did well." Mrs. Natalia, seeing the village appear, shed tears. "We had 2 children with Peter. But he's been gone for 3 years now. It's been so many years since he was taken." "But you're still a happy person, Mrs. Natalia." "That's true. Happy. I lived with him like I had the world in my pocket. And not a day goes by without me remembering him fondly. And our younger grandson looks so much like him." The car pulled up to Mrs. Natalia's house. She got out of the car, her coat was unbuttoned, and a light scarf was open. Underneath, the blue beads appeared. "Are those the same ones Petr gave you on the mountain?" "No, these are different, but also given by him. And those blue beads, they're still carefully kept in my jewelry box." She invited the young people in for tea, but they decided not to linger and drove on. Remembering Mrs. Natalia's story all the way, which was so full of light and warmth that it made them feel somehow joyful inside.